Hello and welcome to the show. There is no longer any doubt. PSG and Lens are the best teams in France right now. Both teams won handsomely at the weekend and are now way ahead of the chasing pack. Behind them, there's an almighty scramble for Champions League qualification with Lille and Monaco in the mix after beating Marseille and Lyon respectively. Just 3 points separate third place Marseille from sixth placed Monaco. All of the latest stories, news and banter is coming up in the French Football Show. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Alongside me today, we've got one of Eurostar's most loyal customers, Tom Williams. Tom, how's it going with you?
Hello, Matt. Yeah, all good, thanks. I was Eurostarring it, as I frequently am at the weekend. This weekend just gone. Hung out with Andy Scott, as I frequently do as well, and it was all jolly nice. We had a very nice brunch together on Sunday.
That's very good.
Saturday. Saturday. Yeah, that.
Well, I'm sure you were talking about the Friday night action, Lens 5, Angers 1. We're going to get stuck into that one, but let me introduce Andy Scott, who is with us, fresh from a disappointing display. A disappointing display, on the golf course. Would you say, Andy?
Well, look, you still couldn't beat me, despite the fact that I was not very good. So leave it at that, I guess.
It was a nice sunny afternoon in Paris. We played 9 holes and it was all square at the end. So that makes a change because Andy's actually pretty good at golf and I'm not. But Lens winning on Friday night, lads, and they went top briefly. PSG moved back on top, beating Nice 4-0 on Saturday night. So there's still 1 point between them. The title race in France bubbling along quite nicely. There's an important date that is coming up, April the 11th, which is the date that Lens are due to host Paris Saint-Germain in a potential title decider. However, the timing of the game is now in doubt because Paris Saint-Germain are playing Liverpool on Wednesday, the 8th of April, so 3 days before that game. And then they're playing again in the second leg of their Champions League quarter-final on the Tuesday night, the 14th of April. So reports today in Ligue have said that Paris Saint-Germain have asked the French League if they can postpone the Ligue match, this big League game against Lens. We know that PSG got their recent game against Nantes postponed so they could focus on the second leg against Chelsea. This is more contentious, though, because Lens, well, they've made it clear they want to play on the 11th, but the LFP, they're having a meeting on Thursday to decide if PSG and indeed Strasbourg, who are playing in the quarterfinals of the Europa Conference League against Mainz and have also asked for their game to be postponed, will be allowed to push the round 29 games back or not. We're going to have the discussion because it is a pretty important topic. So the question this morning that I want to ask is, should the LFP help PSG in their quest to win the Champions League by moving the Lens game back further, or would postponing this crunch game in the title race detract from the title race and indeed the credibility of Ligue 1? It is time for Le Dossier. All right, I'll start with you, Tom, just to get your view on this first. My view is pretty clear, and I'll develop that later on. You know, this is a date that I've had etched in my mind for quite some time. I am scheduled to be at the Stade Félix Bollard to commentate that, so I'm obviously excited and looking forward to it. And I have to say, I would be disappointed if the game gets pushed back, not just for me, but for the suspense and the whole interest of this title race that we've been talking about week after week.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would be ridiculous. It's one thing to postpone a game against a team like Nantes, who are nevertheless fighting for their lives, trying to avoid relegation. It's another thing to want to postpone what is quite literally, or what could be quite literally, a title decider this close to the end of the season. And were they to postpone it, this game would now take place between the penultimate weekend of the season and the final weekend of the season. So I guess if you were looking for positives, you could say that, that would make it even more of a title decider. you can see it from PSG's perspective in that they have had favours with regards to fixture scheduling from the LFP in recent seasons, and it's been massively helpful for them. You know, they won the Champions League last season frequently after getting these kinds of favours from the LFP, and I think that has convinced everyone at the LFP and at PSG and probably within French football as a whole that, trying to be helpful to the teams engaged in European competition, can have beneficial consequences. PSG clearly benefited from having the weekend off in between the two legs of their last 16 tie against Chelsea, and they're clearly hoping for something similar for the quarter-final against Liverpool. But you just find yourself thinking, where does this end? Where does it stop? The rhythm of club football for the elite clubs, domestic fixtures at the weekend, continental fixtures in midweek, that's how it's worked since the European Cup was invented. And that is part of the challenge. Juggling multiple competitions is part of the challenge. And even if PSG weren't one of the richest clubs in the history of football, it would be slightly absurd for them to be getting this kind of assistance. When you take into account the vast resources at their disposal, surely it must be possible for them to manage the fact that they're having to compete on multiple fronts. So as much as you can see where they're coming from, I think it would be a huge shame. I think it would be very embarrassing for French football as well. I mean, this is a story that has already attracted people's attention around Europe. And I think if this game, this potential title decider, were to be postponed as well, as well-meaning as the decision might be, I think it would make French football look pretty silly.
Yeah, and Andy, if PSG do manage to go through, having had that game postponed, they then have a semi-final against Real Madrid or Bayern Munich, and I think the same discussion will come up again, even though we understand that there isn't any space for any other games in midweek, so it could be a question of PSG having to decide, if you like, do they want to have their weekend off in the quarterfinals or in the semi-finals? But we are focusing on PSG because it's a title decider. Other teams have been helped in the past by the French League. And the French League would very often schedule a game on a Friday night, say if Marseille are playing in the Champions League on Tuesday or Wednesday. And, all of that helps. But this seems to be going even further. And of course, they will say, well, hang on, we're helping Strasbourg as well. But the fact that it is this, title decider, and, we'll put that in inverted commas because it may not be, because Lens have got to go to Lille before, and, PSG do have a game in hand. But, it might be.
I think that there's a couple of ways of looking at this. One is that I suppose, I'm going to start with the bigger picture, which is that if you think about the league's international development and the importance to any national competition, and particularly one of the major European leagues, and people might scoff at the French league sometimes, but it is one of the bigger European leagues. So for them, international exposure is important. Income from international broadcast rights is important. So let's take a leaf out of the Premier League, shall we? Which is by far and away the most lucrative league worldwide, both in terms of the money it gets from its domestic broadcasters. It earns far more than anybody else, and also just in terms of international interest. Now, one of the things the Premier League does is it puts itself first. It's not going to be thinking about what benefits a club in a European competition. And this sometimes comes back to bite English clubs. It's part of the debate, perhaps at the moment, that they play too many games or the intensity is too much, that they don't get any time off. The Premier League, the people who organise the Premier League, I'm not going to say they don't care about that, but their priority is their competition, right? Their priority is having...
But they don't need to care, do they, Andy? That, like, the French League needs to care about getting coefficient points, about getting money from European competitions as well.
Okay, well, you just park that for a second, and I think that but just to kind of complete, you're right, but I think to complete the point I was going to make, that ultimately they are not going to shift a very, very, very important game just because it suits one team who plays. Because why would they leave that space in their weekend schedule for a game that is going to attract the limelight worldwide that weekend? And no other, I think. like La Liga are not going to postpone a Real Madrid-Barcelona game if one of the two teams is about to play a Champions League semi-final. They're not going to do it. So they're not exactly... the French Ligue are doing something which the more credible leagues internationally, you might say, just wouldn't do, because they value their own product so much and they want to put this game out there and have as many people watching it as possible. Now, obviously, the danger, you can say, right, well, these are the rules, we can do this, and there's so many things wrong with it. But of course, if nothing else, you've got a potential title decider, which if you move it to in between the last 2 weeks of the season, the chances are that it will not be a title decider. It might be, it might not be. So you're losing a lot of value in that sense. But just fundamentally, why on earth would you... I mean, you want Paris Saint-Germain to do well. Of course you do. You're the league, you want them to do well. I think if you're a rival club, you're entitled to not want them to do well. You might want them to do well, but you might not want them to do well. You're entitled to have your view on that. But just from the point of view of Lens, who don't want this game to be moved, you're allowing PSG to not play 3 games in 7 days. And in order to do that, you're going to force Lens to play 3 games in 8 days at the end of the season and give them a 2-week period where they will not play a single game. It doesn't make any sense. So the argument has to suit both teams. And therefore, for me, the argument has to come down to what Tom has just said, that Paris Saint-Germain, more than any club in world football, I would say, are in a position to play that game, because they have more money. According to the latest Deloitte Football Money League, for example, they had the 4th biggest revenue in world football last year, about 840 million euros revenue over the course of the year. So they have one of the biggest wage bills in world football, like one of the biggest few wage bills in world football. So they can think intelligently at the start of the season and say, right, well, as they did a couple of years ago, rather than give Kylian Mbappe or another player this much money, we will use that money to sign more players, all quality players, to give ourselves more strength and depth. It's up to them to do what they want with that money. And if they're not going to do that, if they're not going to give themselves a bigger squad to cope with the challenges that are put to them, then that's on them. Because, as I say, they're in a position more than any other club to deal with this, because the other clubs in their league have far lower incomes. It's not like the Premier League so they should be able to cope with this, and Lens should not have to suffer the consequences of that. It's as simple as that.
PSG should be able to cope. I agree, certainly with Nantes at home. That's a game they could have rotated. They could have played Nantes and it would have been fine. But if there's one really, really testing game in Ligue 1 right now, it's Lens at the Stade Félix Bollard-de-Leylis. And that is where PSG would want Dembele, and they would and they would want their top players. No, I'm just making the point, but I agree with everything you're saying. And Tom, the point, like one of the things as well that I think about is, of course, for Ligue 1, it's brilliant to have PSG European champions, and I'd love it if they go back to back. It would be amazing. But I think almost, and perhaps even more important than that, is I think having a title race and having a competitive league. For me, whatever PSG do, however well they do in Europe, people will say it's great. Luis Enrique is great. These players are great, but they play in a one-team league. So actually having this Lens side emerge, it seems such a pity to sort of nip that in the bud with this decision.
Completely. I mean, Lens are the story of the season in Liga. I think regardless of whether or not they end up winning the league, what they have done has been absolutely incredible. And, as we've said so many times on this podcast, Liga has been crying out for a proper title race for so long. And here we finally feel like we have one. And on top of that, with the most fantastic contrast between Moneybags PSG and Lens, the kind of archetypal, plucky provincial club with this squad of players, kind of thrown together, a very kind of unlikely basis for a title challenge. And yet here it is. And at just the moment when you feel like the league should be really trying to draw people's attention to that and celebrate that. It's a very easy thing to celebrate. I mean, Lens versus PSG, for so many reasons, is a rivalry that sells itself. And yet what this decision says is, oh, sure, we're great. It's great that we've got this title race and please do watch these matches when they take place. But actually, it's not as important as a French club doing well in the Champions League. It's not as important as PSG, being given the best possible opportunity of making it to the Champions League semi-finals. And as Andy said, I think just the messaging that sends out is very small time. And you can see how the LFP have basically painted themselves into a corner here, because last season, doing these favours for PSG with regard to their schedule worked out really well. And I think retrospectively, there was, a lot of self-congratulation at the LFP on the role that they'd played in PSG winning the Champions League by making things easier for them. And yet, here we are a season later, and, because they moved things around for PSG so winningly last season, they've just completely made a rod for their own back this season. You suspect the average French football fan does not want to see this match postponed, would see it as a fairly absurd turn of events. And yet the LFP has created a precedent itself that makes it very difficult for the LFP to say no to PSG, because their whole approach on this topic up to now has been giving PSG, pretty much everything they asked for.
Well, I mean, hopefully the LFP will be watching this podcast and sense will prevail. I'm just, thinking, what do I do on Saturday, the 11th of April, if I don't have a game to commentate? I lose a bit of revenue. Okay, you might say I get to commentate it later in the season, but I might need a babysitter if it's during the week. I get it. These are
Would someone think about the commentators?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. But we'll see what the LFP decide. I'm interested in your thoughts as well, dear listener. So drop us a line, Ligue1podcast@gmail.com. And while you're at it, rate us, like us, and write to us on Spotify, on YouTube. The French Football Show is very present there, and I'm starting to try to get the community. There's a community tab on the YouTube page, and I'm getting a few thumbs up. I've done a couple of posts. I've had a couple of thumbs up, but nobody's really kind of getting involved yet. So write me a little message, even just to humour me. Just get involved. Apparently, it's important on YouTube. And
any publicity is good publicity.
But I do think it's a good sort of place for this community. We'd have a bit of chat outside of the pod time. Now it is half time already. First half has raced past, but we've got a lot to get through in the rest of the show.